everything's all set. Thank you.
All right. This is the house.
Okay.
Here. There. Power button right there. And you stick it in.
Okay.
Watch it.
All right. Super bad track. And our next speaker is Mr. OHoro. Ryan is the lead for IOActive's security team. If you're unfamiliar with IOActive, I would say it's worth being familiar with. They've done a lot of research over the years, contributed a lot to the community. And please join me in welcoming
So right before I started working on this presentation, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said something to the effect of, I wish I had been doing this all along. And it kind of dawned on me that life, in a way, is a series of moments that you can connect where you say, wow, I really wish I'd been doing it this way all along. So if you guys have recently looked at a vulnerability report or a penetration testing report, I want you to kind of think about what you did with it and what was there and what was missing. And this is kind of the heart of what this journey is for me. So in the industry, we use a couple of different terms: vulnerability assessment, penetration test, red team engagement. They're all used and abused by the marketing departments in our organizations. And so sometimes you'll ask for a pen test but get a vulnerability assessment. Sometimes you'll ask for a red team engagement and you'll get a vulnerability assessment. And various different combinations of those three. Unfortunately, what happens is you'll end up with a 300-page vulnerability report, whether it was done with exploits, whether it was done with Nessus, and you'll have to deal with that somehow. I regularly generate 200 and 300-page vulnerability reports, and not for lack of care for risky issues, but merely because of the size of the environments that I work in. I regularly work in organizations with 100,000, 200,000 nodes, and they ask me to come in and do an internal network penetration test, and it just so happens that they have enough stuff to fill reams of paper. And these vulnerability reports generally are not the audience of the security operations team. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with what a blue team is, this being a very blue kind of conference. The audience of these reports is actually the developers, the IT team. When the blue team ingests vulnerability reports, they put it into the vulnerability management software and they triage it. So what I really wanted to do was increase the utility of these reports for the blue team or the security operations team in the organizations that I was working for. So my very first client at IOActive was a retailer, an online retailer. They did lots and lots of business, and we came in and we did the standard penetration test, got in there, got domain admin, dumped all the creds, and got all something 120 million of their credit cards. This was part of a PCI assessment, but they were one of the companies who said, we want a real penetration test, so the entire environment is in scope, go. So this went great the first time. Went into the boardroom, had all the executives listening to me present all of these critical vulnerabilities, which led to the complete and utter destruction of their environment, as the defenders hate to listen to, because, you know, here I am coming in and breaking everything. You guys have worked really hard to protect, and you know that's obviously an awkward conversation to have. But the problem was that I came back next year and the same thing happened. Things had changed, things had been patched, a lot of things in the report had been fixed, but I got all the credit cards again and I got all of the domain passwords again. Third year, same thing. Fourth year, same thing. And as the years had gone on with the same client, I kept telling myself, wow, these people are idiots. What are they doing? They have 5 people on their security team and they can't get one thing right, is to keep me out of their domain controller. And I chewed on that for a while. And eventually it occurred to me, maybe it wasn't just that client. Maybe I bear some responsibility for their lack of ability to mature based on the work that we were doing for them. Along those lines, we'd been talking about defense in depth for like 10 years. Like even way before I got into security, over 8-9 years ago, people said defense in depth is the way to do it because there's always going to be a vulnerability, and it only takes one, right? Somehow we forgot that defense in depth was a thing, and nobody actually did it. And now we call this era of security the post-vulnerability era, which is a synonym for defense in depth because we have to assume that there's going to be a vulnerability and assume it's going to be exploited. And what we need to be able to do is detect compromise. Regardless of the vulnerabilities in the environment, if we can't detect compromise, we're stuck. We can't respond to anything. Now, when you order a penetration test, the guy who comes in to do it thinks about this. This is what's going to happen. They come in, they break it, they leave a mess. And this is, I'm going to speak generally about penetration testers, but this is the general attitude of penetration testers. They're there for interesting work. They want to get in, they want to break things, and they want to solve their problem, which is breaking your environment. They're not interested in solving your problems, which is securing your environment. And unfortunately, for most penetration testers, their ego gets in the way. Their methodology is opaque. They won't tell you exactly how they do their job. And there's a backlash against penetration testers. I went to the DFIR summit in NOLA recently, and sitting among all of these blue team members and defensive security people, they had nothing but scorn for penetration testers as I listened to them speak. So one of the first things that I had to come to terms with was different clients and different organizations have different levels of maturity, and that would have to dictate how I went about doing my penetration testing in terms of red team. So just to be clear, when you do a red team engagement, there's going to be penetration testing. And that penetration testing needs to have other components in order to fit within the model of the red team. And if there is no blue team, there is no red team. So you cannot have a red team engagement in an organization that does not have a blue team to sit down and work with them, just so those terms are clear. So if you're the type of organization, let's say, okay, so I was let's see, it was, I want to say it's 2013. I went into a very large organization. I sat in their SOC, and this was the first time I spent an extended period of time in a SOC. They had well over 50 people in this SOC, and they were processing billions of events per day. And now that's really not that unheard of, and it's not that uncommon. But I sat down to start my penetration test, and my port turned off. And I turned around to the guy behind me and said, "Hey man, my network jack's not working." And he's like, "Oh yeah, we probably flagged you with the IPS and turned off your port." And I'm like, "Whoa, yeah, that's pretty cool. Why hasn't any of the other clients that I've worked with done that?" And so I started talking to people in the SOC and asking them what they do and what their workflow was. And they were a fully mature organization. Nothing about what they did was you could consider deficient security-wise. And I was very impressed. And I've modeled everything that I've done after their operations. So you have that. You have a company that processes a couple billion events per day, all the way down to what we would call half a security guy, which is the IT guy who also sets the passwords on the VPN or adds users or gets a daily email with events attached that he's supposed to review for compliance purposes. And this difference in maturity, this spectrum, that means that when I sit down to do a penetration test or a red team engagement in this case, I have to be able to tune my methodology to their capability of detection. If I'm out there doing APT stuff with these guys, with these companies that only have a half a guy doing security, it's wasted on them. If they can't do basic detection, if they can't do basic incident response, if they can't detect ICAR on one of their endpoints, there's no point in going full bore. So at this point, I started gauging my clients and gauging my projects with the maturity of the client in mind, instead of just going at my old standbys over and over again. So prevention, as I talked about earlier, vulnerability management is about prevention and prevention only. And vulnerability management is largely an automated process now. So getting to that level of maturity, that's the first step. If you can ingest, if you're doing regular scanning of like Nessus or Qualys reports, there you go, you're on your way. If you stop at that point, you fail to address real-life threats because, as I alluded to earlier, there's always going to be a vulnerability, especially vulnerabilities that nobody else knows about, and it only takes one of those for your organization to be compromised. And you have to be able to detect the compromise. Speaking of detecting the compromise, detection. So I was in an organization, it was a financial organization, they did payment processing. They asked us to come in after years of doing, for us doing audits for them, basically checking boxes and making sure that, they said they made sure they answered correctly to the questions that we were asking them. We'd done this for several years previously. They asked us to come in and do an actual penetration test. And I had been thinking about that large SOC for many, many months. And this was the day that I decided, okay, so I'm going to do something a little bit differently. After performing every action, after running every tool, I opened up an Excel spreadsheet and added a row that says, this is the date and time, this is the thing I did, and this is where I did it. And at the end of that engagement, I handed that Excel spreadsheet to my point of contact, and I said, go to your scene, show me exactly where you saw all of these events happen. And he came back to me 24 hours later and he said, yeah, we didn't detect this one, which was my Nessus scan of the internal network. The tap has been unplugged. We don't know how long and we don't know who, but we haven't been detecting internal network events for at least 3 weeks. And he didn't know because their logging ended at 3 weeks. So that box could have been unplugged for a year and he would have never known. And this was the aha moment where I said, wow, when I go in and I do these penetration tests, I throw up all of these indicators, these things that should not be happening on the network during a normal workday. And if I can communicate that information to the client in some way, they're going to be far better off because I can tell them how to be better at detection. And there is no response without detection. Even if you have an environment that's perfectly free of public vulnerabilities, and let's say somebody found the NSA cache of awesome O-Days and found your Cisco device, which happens to be vulnerable, and I don't know, maybe you were asleep that day, and somebody popped it, you wouldn't know because your ability to detect is deficient. If you didn't have logging on that router to detect the unusual login behavior from that particular attacker, there's no way you're going to respond to it. And that's part of the discussion during these red team engagements is, okay, so I did this, you need to do this to detect it, and this is the only way to get to the response phase. One of the other things that I needed to learn about being on a red team is that it's very hard to do security engineering and operations. You have the constraints of time, you have an overwhelming number of events to analyze and categorize, and a good portion of your job is trying to automate these processes on a continuous basis. Ingesting IOCs, making sure they get to the right place, initiating responses, and analyzing, doing threat hunting, analyzing incidents and things like that. And you're constantly fighting your management for money and time and resources. And for me to not think about the business and the impact that my testing has and my recommendations have on the business, if I just say, wow, if you just enabled SSL client certificates on everything in the organization, that would solve all of your problems. Obviously, managing SSL client certificates across an entire organization is a daunting task. Another thing I really needed to grasp was that in order to truly give value to these organizations, especially the more mature ones, is that I had to go out, I had to look at the attackers and see exactly what they were doing. They need the red team needs to do evil as evil does. And as a penetration tester, I learned to hack in what you might call safe places. I mean, back in the AOL proggy days, of course, I bent a law or two, but the majority of my learning experience has been in environments where I've been permitted to work. And that means the amount of noise that I made and the care that I had to take in order to prevent from being detected was very low. And what I have to learn from attackers, and especially the most advanced of attackers, is to be quiet and to be stealthy and to not leave tracks. Red team engagements absolutely, positively need to be goal-oriented because attackers are goal-oriented. I recall the Microsoft blog about attackers thinking in graphs and defenders thinking in lists. A graph leads to a goal. A graph leads to a single point in an organization. They want to get to that golden egg. And if your red team isn't planning and executing in a goal-oriented manner with the business objectives in mind, then you're not being effective as a red team. So in the same vein as emulating attackers, the tools that I use, the existing tools that I use, are okay for using in a red team engagement, and that spectrum of sophistication allows you a little bit of wiggle room. But the most important thing that I had to do was learn how to tune the tools effectively so that they weren't leaving breadcrumbs all over the place. The very first thing that Snort detects is an Nmap scan. And if you're out there doing recon on the internal network with Nmap, like almost all penetration testers do, you have already given up. You've already given up, essentially. You've thrown out the flag. The Nmap is coming from this host, and this is where the blue team is going to come find you. So you can't just dash your way, dash T your way to stealth in the network. You need to do things like scan a single port once every 5 seconds on each host that you're looking at, and do so in a random order across different routes on the network. If you do so sequentially on any given host, you look at the Snort rules and you're going to get busted. And that's part of what I do. Is I look at these detection engines and I say, how can I use these tools in order to avoid these detection rules that the blue teams are using? And log deletion, by the way. I never before had deleted logs before I decided to become more sneaky. Most penetration testers wouldn't bother with that either. Social engineering, it was really important, and it's really important for any red team to have at least one person who is good at social engineering, because we're seeing that probably around 50% of successful breaches originate from phishing attacks. And if you don't know how to craft a convincing email template to get someone to open an attachment or visit a link, then you're missing a huge part of the infiltration phase of an actual real live attack. And I learned social engineering well before I got interested in red teaming, just because I really like lying to people. It's a lot of fun. I'm exceptionally good as a liar. I hate lying for the wrong reasons. So doing social engineering gives me an outlet for that skill. Like lock picking. Like you buy some test locks to fiddle around with. You don't go to your place of business and like start trying to open the data center door. You go home and try to open your acrylic locks. And team. So it's really important that a red team be an actual team with diverse skill sets. If you don't have people who are catching shells, and if you don't have people who are skilled at building payloads and doing moving laterally on the network and combining all of those skills and getting different perspectives on how to execute attacks, then you're also missing the other side of the coin. Attackers work in teams. They have diverse skill sets. You need to have a mirror of that in your own red team. And at IO Active, that's what we strive to do as well. I never want to go in an organization just on my own and try to do a red team assessment, because then it's just me trying to figure out this complex ecosystem of threats. So collaboration is really important. I suggest that blue teams be composed of people from multiple disciplines within the organization. I mean, the blue team should ideally have 3 or 4 people at least on it who, people who look at the glass, people who, recommend configurations for improvement, yada, yada, yada. There should be a lot of people involved in this process, the entire red team, the entire blue team, and everyone needs to show up to the table. So when I do red team engagements, I schedule regular checkpoints, and everyone needs to be at that checkpoint so everyone can be on the same page and we can communicate information back and forth. I can say, we did this week. Did you detect it? And they say, no, we didn't detect it. Okay, now let's have a discussion on how we can go about detecting that type of attack. Now, I don't need to give up the golden goose immediately. I don't need to tell them what I'm going to do in the future. That kind of thing can stay secret. But there needs to be open and honest communication between the red team and the blue team, because the red team is learning from the blue team how the defenses work, and the blue team is learning from the red team how the attackers work. Documentation. Oh my lord, if you ask a penetration tester to log everything they do, they will look at you like you killed their dog. They have no patience for process and organization and methodology, and least of all, writing stuff down. And this is the only way that I've found to turn on logging on all my tools and put it in a centralized place and then summarize it for the client in order to effectively communicate the stuff that I did so they can go find the stuff that I did. And that's what's most important, that they be able to detect what I do, not actually what I do. External teams. I'm extremely biased because I'm a consultant, but I'll tell you a quick story. I was talking to some of a red team leader on a very big client. He had a very large red team, and he told me, you know what, our blue team is great at catching our red team. And that's about it. So red teams can get stale. If they're not continually refreshed with new brains and new intelligence, it can be very easy for your blue team to detect them. And they were also using a standard rat package. So the blue team was able to find them based on the IOC generated by their rat. They had to whitelist their rat in order to help minimize the impact of using the same tool over and over again for every red team engagement in that organization. So I feel that bringing in a third party every once in a while to keep things fresh and exciting and teach your team new tricks is a great idea. For me, intel gathering was really important because I have to study the attackers on a continuous basis. And I do this, I follow researchers on Twitter primarily to do this. There's lots of interesting malware and defensive things just being chatted and communicated on in these circles on Twitter. I read publications from different organizations and vendors, and even government agencies. Like, I read the stuff that comes out of the NSA. It's like, wow, that's a really good idea. I'll try that next time. And I spend a lot of my free time studying and following and mimicking, and I do so in my lab. I have a virtual lab, and I can test all my tools and techniques in there. I have it set up on ESXi, and I have the vSwitch set to hub mode, and then I have Security Onion installed. And I use Security Onion to look at what events my attacks are generating. And this is how I can tune my attacks to minimize the detection signatures of my work. And that helps me to continuously improve the blue team by telling them how to detect me. And ethics. So I went to the DFIR summit, and this was my first exposure to large amounts of blue team members. And I saw a presentation by a very large company who had created a tool that's designed to be installed on every single endpoint on the network. And that tool allowed them to query on disk and in memory any grep string that you could come up with. And that meant that that person or that team that had control of that tool was the NSA of their corporation. And you generally, I think most of you guys are blue side, you as the blue team are the NSA of your corporations. And me as a red team, I'm the attacker. I'm the China of the corporation. We're both going to encounter stuff out there on the network that people think or find personal to them. Like we say, yeah, it's a work asset, it's a corporate asset, they shouldn't be doing personal stuff. But we need to be very mindful of the fact that these are real people doing real things who have lives. They need to talk on Twitter, they look at YouTube occasionally, and they download stuff to their workstations. So if you find stuff, be very cautious about how you deal with that. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys listening. Are there any questions?
Any questions? All right, we got a question.
Let's see here. I did. Okay. Without detection, there can be no... Somebody said it. Who said response? Yeah, right there.
All right, so I'm going to put this right before we go online, so you guys are all usually the announcement about launch. So if anybody was in track 2 and